Thank you for coming. Please turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. As we're drawing towards the end of that chapter, we're in the section of the book of 1 Corinthians as Paul discusses different problems in the church of Corinth. And it's chapters 11 through 14, he's talking about the problems of conduct in the assemblies, various aspects of disorder and confusion in their assemblies, in particular discussing the Lord's Supper and how they abused the Lord's Supper in this context. And we talked about several things that they were doing wrong. First of all, they were making a common meal out of the Lord's Supper rather than a memorial to the death of the Lord. And they were satisfying their own selfish desires rather than being concerned about other people or respectful to the needs of other people in participating. They disregarded whether or not other people had the opportunity to participate. They just did what they wanted to do. And the result was disorder and different acts going on at the same time. So that's where an overview of the problems we've been discussing. We've really only talked about the first part of it so far, what Paul is talking about to correct these errors. And the lesson we've learned at this point is he's teaching them to focus on the Lord's Supper as a spiritual memorial rather than a physical meal for satisfy their hunger or whatever. It's a spiritual memorial. And we'll talk more about the specifics as we go along. That's where we were at the end of our study last time. We told them about the meaning of the Lord's Supper as a remembrance of the body and the blood of the Lord. Then we should do all according to His will. Let's not do that one yet. Okay. Questions or discussion before we begin tonight? All right. So that was verse 26 that we discussed last time. Said you proclaim the Lord's death till He comes. So we want to read 27 through the end of the chapter. Okay, let's read 1 Corinthians 11, 27 through 34. 27 through 34. We'd like to read that for us, please. Bill, 27 through 34, please.
Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not the discerning of the Lord's body. For this reason many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. For if any would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. Therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. But if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment, and the rest I will set in order when I come.
Okay. So we look back at verse 27 then, and this is question number 42. He says, whoever eats or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner, guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. The Old King James says unworthily. So what does it mean? In what sense were they eat or drinking unworthily? What does it mean to eat or drink unworthily? Karen.
They were not doing it in remembrance of the Lord's crucifixion and His body and blood, but as a common meal.
Okay. So first of all, they were not doing it as a memorial to the death of Jesus. Okay? Other comments on the idea of being unworthily? Rick?
Well, I look at it as if you're not a Christian and you still partake of it, you're doing that unworthily because you're not doing it because Jesus saved you and shed His blood for you. And His body wasn't broken for the unbeliever. But also, if you're a believer and your mind is not on the Lord's Supper as you're partaking it, I look at that as being unworthy.
Okay. So we see what they did in their failure to partake properly. But Rick has introduced the idea of what are some ways that we could be guilty of partaking unworthily. First of all, what does the word unworthily mean? Frank?
One aspect of it is it would be profaning the body of our Savior, Jesus Christ.
Okay. He says you're guilty of the body and blood of the Lord if you do that. The word unworthily is, in the Old King James, is an adverb, which means it's talking about how you do it. Have you ever known people, I haven't heard anybody for a long time who hold this view that I know of, but I remember when I was a kid, there were some people who thought that you had to be worthy to partake of the Lord's Supper. And if they were guilty of some sin in their lives, they said, well, I'm not worthy, so I won't partake. What about that idea? That you have to be worthy in order to partake. And if you're not worthy, then you shouldn't participate. Thoughts on that as related to this unworthily, Susie?
Well, just like you said, it's used as an adverb. It's like you said, the manner in which one takes. It's not an adjective describing a person. It's not describing a noun, which would be a person. It's an adverb describing the action, the way in which you take.
Okay. So let's talk about the manner in which we partake. Okay, other comments? Susie?
Well, we see how they were doing it. It was in an irreverent and careless manner. He says earlier, he said, you weren't partaking of the Lord's Supper. This wasn't the Lord's Supper that you were doing. So it was in a careless, irreverent manner.
Okay. All right, so if we're careless, if we're irreverent, if we don't respect the significance of what we're doing, we have the same problem. We may not do it in the same way, but as Rick is pointing out, if we're not truly appreciating that this is a memorial to the body and the blood of the Lord, remembering what he did for us and the significance of it, then we're partaking unworthily, in an unworthy manner as well. Okay, other comments? Frank?
Because we are sinful creatures, none of us are worthy of what Jesus did for us. And we're not worthy of that sacrifice of Jesus, but for the grace of God who gave Jesus to save us.
Okay. So who's worthy of the blood of Christ and the forgiveness of his sins? None of us are worthy of it. Now, if a person had a sin in their lives, rather than not partaking of the Lord's Supper, what should they do? Susie?
Confess and repent.
Yeah, correct the sin. Not partaking of the Lord's Supper doesn't solve any problems. The thing to do is to correct your life and then participate. So this has nothing to do with whether there's a problem in your life. This is talking about how you partake of the Lord's Supper, the act of the communion, whether or not you're doing it in a proper manner. Okay? Other comments on verse 27 and the manner of partaking? Nancy?
Well, back in John 6, when Jesus is talking about what is going to become this remembrance of him, when you start up there, he starts out in verse 48 and says, I am the bread of life. Then he goes down and in verse 50 he says, this is the bread which came down from heaven. And he says that 3 times in that context, carrying with it the weight and the importance. This came down from heaven. And so when you do this in a careless or thoughtless manner, you are doing it in an unworthy manner, because he has explained this. This is the bread that came down from heaven. And then he goes on to say, whoever eats my bread, is in me. But it's to show us, he says this so many times through there, how this came down from heaven. And even here on earth, we understand about something coming from heaven and the source. So to me, that's part of it, is not recognizing that this came down from heaven in the form of Christ, the Word.
So back in verse 27 now, he says, guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. In what sense are we guilty of the body and blood of the Lord if we partake in an unworthy manner? In what sense are we guilty of the body and blood of the Lord? Thoughts on that? Terry?
Well, we're treating him as if his body and his blood was an unholy thing.
Okay. So I think someone earlier used the word profane. That's the idea. We're not showing the proper respect for his body and his blood. And so rather than benefiting from this memorial, which not only honors Christ, but should be an encouragement to us, to edify us, but not only we don't receive the benefit, but in fact we receive the condemnation for failure to do it as we should. Okay? Other comments? Where are we in the questions now? Yes, Karen, go ahead.
I think Rick introduced the topic of a non-Christian partaking, and I think it's good to remember that if a non-Christian partakes, most of the time they don't understand a lot of things about being a Christian. And if they partake, they are no more lost than they were before. So if you get an opportunity to study with them, that's not where you want to start. You want to start with the plan of salvation. You want to start with faith in the Lord, with serving the Lord, and then the rest will follow. It's one of those things where there's a lot more important things for them to understand.
Okay. Comments? Other comments? Okay, question number 43 I asked, and we've discussed it, why we should understand the spiritual significance. But I asked, how does that relate to the purpose of baptism? What is the comparison between understanding the purpose of the Lord's Supper and understanding the purpose of baptism? Do you see a connection there? Susie?
They're both physical actions that have spiritual applications.
Okay. All right, so if a person gets dipped in the water but doesn't do it for the purpose of receiving remission of sins, have they received the benefit of the baptism? No. It says, Acts 2:38 says, be baptized for the remission of sins. It has to be done for the right reason. So you have the outward action that needs to be right, but you also have an inner meaning that needs to be right. And if you're wrong either in the action or the meaning, then you're not only not blessed, but you actually have profaned the teaching of the Lord. Same thing in the Lord's Supper. There's a physical action, eating and drinking, but that's symbolic of the spiritual meaning of the memorial of the blood and body of Christ. So to go through the motions without knowing or meaning what you're doing is actually profaning an act of the Lord. Okay, anything else on verse 27? All right, moving on then to verse 28, then question number 44. What should we do about that? Steve?
Examine our hearts. Examine our hearts.
Examine our hearts, okay. It says examine yourself, he says. And so let me eat the bread and drink that cup. Okay, comments on examine yourself, verse 28? All right, back to our discussion of verse 27. What are you examining? What is it you're examining? Rick?
Whether you're taking it in the right manner and honoring Christ and what Christ did for us and being obedient in every way to God's scriptures. Make sure that we're not using it as just something common.
Okay, so you're examining how you're doing it. Are you doing it properly? As we've been discussing, are you doing it in a worthy manner so that you're not guilty of the body and blood? That's the way to avoid being guilty of the body and blood of the Lord, is to examine the way you're doing it and eat the bread and drink the cup of the Lord properly, with a proper understanding of the meaning of what's being done. Okay? Susie?
I looked at this, I guess, a little bit differently. That yes, we have to examine ourselves, but also during the process of the Lord's Supper, that we need to prepare our minds in taking the Lord's Supper. That we've come here for a purpose, and we need to be prepared mentally for that, and do our best to eliminate distractions for ourselves and for others that help us. We sing a song in preparation of the Lord's Supper. We read scriptures in preparation of the Lord's Supper. We're trying to help us do this in a worthy manner.
Okay, so you're saying we not only should examine ourselves while we're partaking, but prepare so that we do it properly. Okay, other comments? Steve?
We're supposed to live in a way that honors Christ's sacrifice.
Okay, obviously, our life should reflect the significance of our respect for the blood and death of Jesus, although that's not what the worthy manner is talking about, but we should certainly make sure that we live a life that's pleasing according to God. Okay? Verse 29 then, notice, carries on, for, that is, you examine yourself and eat and drink, for he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself. Okay? So there's a penalty for not doing it properly. Okay, so we're on the questions then again. Question 45, just what's the consequence? I guess I just answered it, didn't I? What does it mean to discern the Lord's body? Last part of verse 29. First of all, what does the word discern mean? What does the word discern mean? Discern the Lord's body. If you don't discern it, you're guilty of the body by the Lord. So discern means what, Rick?
Understanding what you're doing.
Okay. All right. Other comments? Discern means, Frank.
To discriminate what the body and the blood of Christ in the sacrifice, in his sacrifice, means for our salvation.
Okay. So to discern something means to recognize the meaning of it, the significance of it. Okay. So specifically, we're discerning the Lord's body. That is the significance of the Lord's death for us and what we're remembering when we partake of the Lord's Supper. Okay, so we must discern, recognize, understand the significance of what's being done. Otherwise, we eat and drink judgment to ourselves because we're not discerning the Lord's body. Okay, other comments on 29? Terry?
The Corinthians were doing was taking the bread and the fruit of the vine as a common meal. They were not discerning that as something different than a common meal. And so they weren't partaking of the Lord's Supper because they didn't look at the bread and the fruit of the vine in the right way. They just took it as something to fill their physical need. This is a spiritual feast where we discern the difference between the physical that we're holding in our hand to the spiritual meaning of what we're doing.
Okay. So the situation in Corinth helps us understand why Paul's saying the things that he does. It helps us to see the problem that they were having, that they weren't discerning the Lord's body. To them, they had gotten away from the spiritual meaning of it, and it was just a meal to them. But we could be guilty of a similar thing, and maybe in a somewhat different way. But if we don't recognize or appreciate what we're doing, the meaning of it, if we're just going through the motions, many times in our studies in the Psalms and in the Minor Prophets, remember how many times the prophets rebuked the people of Israel because they were doing the sacrifices and what have you that they were supposed to do, but they didn't mean it. They were just going through the motions. Same problem here. If we don't understand and mean what we're doing, we're going through the motions, but instead of being blessed by what we're doing, we're eating and drinking judgment to ourselves. Other comments? Okay. And that brings, well, by the way, this to me almost seems like a silly question, but I've had people question it. What is it? What is the Lord's body in verse 29? What's that talking about? The Lord's body. Here.
His body on the cross.
Yeah. Isn't that obvious in the context? I've had people say that it's the church. You have to discern the church when you take the Lord's Supper. That isn't what he's talking about. I'm not saying that church is not important, but that's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about the significance of the Lord's Supper and the body and blood of the Lord. Okay? All right, verse 30. What was the consequence in verse 30 of their failure to discern the Lord's body, to partake with a proper understanding and meaning and not in a worthy manner? What was the consequence in verse 30? And that's question number 46. What consequence was having, Bill?
They're weak and sick, and many of them are asleep.
Okay. So, of course, the question then is, what does that mean? So I ask you, what is the word sickly and sleep? How are they used? What sense were they weak and sick and sleeping? Neil?
Well, they're still in sin and separated from God.
Okay. That's the way I took it. Spiritual sickness. I don't know of anything that says that if you don't partake of the Lord's Supper right, you're going to get physically sick and maybe even die. But spiritually, that's what happens because it's a spiritual failure. It's a sin. And sin leads to spiritual disease. Many scriptures talk about sin as being weakness, sickness, and ultimately spiritual death. Okay? Other comments on verse 30 and the consequence he says would come upon some of them. Frank.
Some thoughts I had about it was that spiritual weakness, that they were weak in faith and asleep in their spiritual growth.
Okay. All right, so spiritually they weren't growing like they should, certainly, because they weren't doing what would bless their service to the Lord. Other comments on verse 30? Being weak and sickly? Rick?
Well, 2 Timothy 2:15 tells us to study to show ourselves approved. So we do strengthen our spirituality. We do strengthen ourselves in God's Word.
Okay. Whenever we do what's right, it helps us be stronger spiritually. When we do what's wrong, it makes us weaker spiritually. If we don't correct it, it leads to spiritual death. And so that's what he's describing. It's such a serious thing. Whether or not we're doing properly in a worthy manner the Lord's Supper, what we mean, what we're doing, is a serious thing. It makes the difference between being spiritually wholesome, healthy, or spiritually sick, and ultimately spiritual death. Okay? Anything else on 30? Terry?
It's the same thing as if you're mocking what has happened. Like the ones that stood at the foot of the cross and said, come down from there. You know, you saved yourself. You saved others. You can't save yourself. It's a mocking of the very memorial that Jesus gave us to remember what he did for us when we're not remembering what the meaning of those things are and thinking about them.
And we might think of different kinds of memorials today that maybe not spiritual, but memorials like in Washington, D.C., some of the memorials that are there, to honor people who've done great things in the history of our country. But if somebody just belittles them or, worse yet, vandalizes them or something like that, it shows a lack of appreciation for the significance of the memorial. Same thing here, but in a far greater sense. To not do the Lord's Supper properly is to, as Terry said, make a mockery, to profane this which is spiritual significance of our service to the Lord for what he's done for us. Okay? All right, now then, verse 31, he talks about how that they were weak and sickly and not partaking properly. Verse 31, question number 47, he says then what we should judge ourselves. so that we're not judged. So what's the significance of judging ourselves? In verse 31, question 47. Judging yourselves means what? Come.
To discern your own behavior.
Okay. Back to examining yourself, as in verse 28. Judge yourself. Examine what you're doing and judge whether or not you're doing properly. Make the proper determination about whether or not you're doing properly what you should be doing. Okay? If we do that, he said we would not be judged by whom? By whom would we not be judged if we judge ourselves properly? Rick?
We will not be chastened by the Lord.
Ultimately, it's God, isn't it? Because verse 32 talks about being chastened by the Lord. Okay. Other comments on if we judge ourselves, we're not going to be judged? There's a sense, I think, also in which we might be judged by others, back to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and talking about the withdrawing from those who are in sin. The way things were being done here in Corinth, I would say these people, if they didn't straighten out, they certainly should have been withdrawn from for what they were doing. So there's an ultimate judgment by God, but there could be a sense of judgment by other faithful Christians as well. Other comments on 31? Rick?
You look at the elders is to shepherd the flock, and they're to know their flock.
Yes. Okay, that's a good point too. I remember times when, not in this congregation, but other congregations, when the young people would sit together, a lot of times at the back of the building, the auditorium, talking back and forth, cutting up through the whole service, including the Lord's Supper. Sitting back there just laughing and joking and cutting, making everything's a big deal, just a big joke to them, rather than recognizing the seriousness of it. They need to be judged for that. And I don't necessarily mean of course, we don't have an eternal judgment, but people need to talk to them. Tell them that's not right. That's not the way to treat the memorial to the Lord's death, who died for their sins too. Okay, other comments on 31. All right, brings us now to 32. When we are judged, he says, we are chastened by the Lord, that we not be condemned with the world. So question number, let's see, we can talk about 48. 49, how does the Lord chasten us? How does the Lord chasten us? What does the Lord do to chasten us when we're judged? Rick?
Spiritual heart, where it belongs at, then our guilt, our conscience itself will chasten us. It will make us know that we've done wrong.
All right, so first of all, that's if we judge ourselves. Verse 31, that we don't need to be judged by the Lord. So start off that we need to examine our own hearts, our own lives, back to examine yourself in verse 28 so that you do it in a worthy manner. Okay? Come on.
In Hebrews 12, 5 through 7, it reads, And ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when you are rebuked of him. For when the Lord loves, he chasteneth, and scourges every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as sons, and when the Son, for what the Son is he whom the Father chasteneth not.
Okay, so the Lord chastens us, doesn't he? Not just at the judgment day, but in this life. What are some ways the Lord chastens us in this life even before we get to the judgment? What are some ways the Lord chastens us in this life? Susie. Oh, Terry.
Well, his word is a chastening to us. When we read, like they would have read this letter that Paul wrote to them, he was chastening him, but Paul was speaking for the Lord. It was coming from God, this chastening.
Okay. And you and I, as we read this right now, if we haven't been partaking of the Lord's Supper, probably wouldn't this chasten us? wouldn't we be rebuked and our hearts condemn us if we weren't doing it right? So the Lord chastens us through the Word, that's for sure, and therefore through the preaching and teaching of the Word. Okay, how else does the Lord chasten us? Any other ways, Susie?
There are consequences to our sins. We can be forgiven of the sins if we repent, but God doesn't take away the consequences of those.
Okay. All right. Sometimes there are consequences in this life. Okay. Other discussion of the Lord's chasing us. We've already talked about one way, haven't we? Through the elders or leaders in the church rebuking us, the preaching and so forth. And if necessary, even withdrawal. Those are forms of the Lord chasing us that He's authorized. Okay. So the way to we can avoid all that then, if we will not be judged, condemned like the world will be, we can avoid all that if we judge ourselves. If we examine our own hearts and own lives and make sure we do it right with the proper understanding of the significance of it. That way we don't have to be judged with the world. Okay? Other comments on 32? Velma.
Sometimes people think God's judgments are harsh, but in the chapter or the verses I read, He does it because He loves us.
Like a father disciplining his child. And the end result of it, the purpose of it is righteousness, the passage says. So it's not pleasant to be shown you're wrong, especially if it's spiritually wrong and the Word of God is rebuking you. But it's done for our good, that we can be right with the Lord and not be judged with the world, he says. Anything else through 32? All right, now we get into 33 and question number 50. We have different translations. The Old King James says, my brethren, when you come together to eat, tarry one for another. And the New King James, and as far as I know, just about every other translation says, wait for one another. So what does that mean? And how does it solve the problem in Corinth? I really think it helps us in, especially 33 and 34, to understand those verses when we relate it to the problem that existed at Corinth and how Paul is trying to solve the problem. So what does it mean to wait for one another in the context of the problem in Corinth? Right.
One translation I found says to wait your proper turn. If a man is really hungry, let him satisfy his appetite at home.
Okay. Wait your proper turn. I'm sure that's not what that's not a technical translation, but I think it's the idea. Karen, go ahead.
Well, back in verse 21, when he starts introducing the topic, he says the problem of each one taking his own supper before another. So they were literally not waiting for others to get there. They just went ahead.
Okay, not only waiting for others to get there, but not waiting for others to be ready to partake of the Lord's Supper. Not waiting till other people have their opportunity to partake. Okay, other comments on the wait one for that, Susie?
Well, isn't this something that they were supposed to do together? That it was communion and fellowship. And so the point was that they do this all together as a body to honor and memorialize the death of Christ.
Okay, comments? I made this point earlier in the chapter, but it's really going to help us, I think, to understand chapter 11 when we get to chapter 14. Because it will help us to see the mess they had in their assemblies. And what was going on in their assemblies, chapter 14 is talking about the spiritual gifts. But they had different people doing different things at the same time. Over here somebody speaking in a tongue, over here somebody prophesying, over here somebody singing a song. And so it's just a disorder, confusion, and that's why he concludes that all things be done decently and in order. The problem in this particular case was the Lord's Supper, as in verse 21, even if everybody was there, didn't matter to some people whether other people were ready to eat or not. I'm ready to eat. I'm going to eat. Whatever you're doing, that's up to you, but I'm going to do something else. We should all wait for the same activity and do the same activity. It's not just the Lord's Supper. That's my point. It's not just the Lord's Supper. The same thing is true for all of our activities. We should wait for one another in all that we do. If it's time to sing, we should all sing. Don't say, I'm not going to wait for you. I want to have my Lord's Supper. I'm going to pray. If it's time to pray, we should all pray. If it's time for the Lord's Supper, we should all pray for the Lord's Supper. Everything we do should be done decently and in order, everybody focusing on the same thing at the same time. Okay, so the wait one for another is not just, I don't see, it's just for the Lord's Supper, but that's what he's talking about here. In a whole assembly, it should be orderly in a way that everybody together focuses on the same thing. Okay? Other comments? Karen?
An example of not waiting in a different context. A couple of years ago, we were visiting a very large congregation, had to be 200. And so their practice was when you came into the building, a large vestibule, there was a large table, and they had these disposable cups with the Lord's Supper and then a wafer.
This was during the COVID thing.
Everyone picked up one and then took it to their seat, and there was a place in front of you where you put it and waited. So when it came time to take the Lord's Supper, they, of course, they're all used to this, but David and I picked them up, and we couldn't figure out how to get the wafer apart. We'd never done it before, and with our arthritis in our hands, so we passed them to our daughter Susan, who was sitting next to him, to us, for her to get it off. And before she got it back to us, they were on to the partaking of the juice, the fruit of the vine, the fruit of the vine. And we had hardly finished partaking of the fruit of the vine by the time we got it back and figured everything out, when the man got up to lead the next song. I don't know if this was their normal practice, but the whole thing for this crowd of 200 people it couldn't have taken more than a minute. So I think, for one thing, they just weren't giving enough time to discern the Lord's body, and also maybe understand that some people needed a little longer to do that. But the main thing was the whole thing took less than a minute for this large crowd of people, and it was over. It was astounding. I just sat there just dismayed, and I couldn't believe it. They were not really discerning the Lord.
And are hindering people from discerning the Lord's body because they weren't waiting one for another. Okay, so there's different ways of failing to do what he's describing here. But on the screen, the two middle points, I believe, is what he's talking about here. Everybody focusing on each act at the same time. Wait one for another. Wait till the others are ready, and then wait till they're done before you go on. And give everybody an opportunity to participate. Don't rush through what you're doing in such a way that people can't do it. Or you move on to something before people are able. We want everybody to be able to do not just the Lord's Supper, but the songs, the prayers, everything. Think about one another, be considerate of one another, and so that we're all able to participate. Otherwise, we're thoughtless, and the result is disorder and confusion. Okay, so we have an extreme example of it here in 1 Corinthians 11, but the principle, I believe, has a number of applications to us as well. Other comments on 33 before we close? Okay, we'll take up 34, then go into chapter 12 the next time. Thank you.